U.S. President Donald Trump announces he's suspending funding to the World Health Organization pending a review into its handling of the coronavirus outbreak. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The president will also soon announce a new task force to reopen the American economy, but that's not going down well with a number of governors who say the president doesn't have the authority to force states to reopen. All this taking place as the International Monetary Fund warns the world is facing the worst recession since the 1930s. CGTN'S Yin Yue caught up with Gita Gopinath, the IMF's chief economist, who had a rather grim outlook for the world economy.
We are projecting global growth to be negative 3% in 2020. So now that makes this the worst recession since the Great Depression. It's just much worse than the global financial crisis. Now we are projecting a recovery in 2021 for the global economy when growth would be 5.8%. But to be clear, this is only a partial recovery, which means that the level of economic activity will still be below the levels we had projected before the crisis, even in 2021. So this is a very sharp reversal in just 3 months. So the speed of it is unprecedented. So like I said, it's the worst since the Great Depression. And the characteristics of it are threefold. One is the magnitude, which we just talked about. The second is the speed. And you can see that when you look at measures of unemployment and jobless claims around the world. The magnitude of that and how quickly that's happening is really unprecedented. And the third is the uncertainty, tremendous uncertainty. Now, there's always uncertainty in a crisis, but this time around, I would say it's like threefold. Why? Because the shock is not something we've seen before. It's a pandemic. It's not something that we can control very easily, and it depends upon science and what epidemiologists think.
That was IMF Chief Economist Gita Gopinath. Well, there's lots to unpack here. I want to bring in our panel. Joining me here in Washington is CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. From Beijing via Skype, Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. And from New York, Anthony Chan was a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase Company. Well, welcome to all of you to the show. Nathan, let me just start with you and that news which we just got about an hour ago, the president announcing that the United States is going to be suspending payments to the World Health Organization. Relations, we know, between the United States, or between this president and the World Health Organization, have not been good, but this is a very ominous turn, isn't it?
Well, yeah, he's been hinting at this for the last week or so, essentially pointing the finger at the WHO, even though he sort of praised China's response and the WHO in the beginning. Now that there's 600,000 cases here and 25,000 deaths, the US president is essentially saying we are suspending funding. Now, he is right in the fact that the US provides a lot of the funding. They are the biggest single funder. I think it's 24 or 25%, about 400 million a year. Sorry, he says billion, but it's about between 4 and 500 million. They already are in arrears, I think, to the tune of 100 to 200 million. So I don't know whether they'll just refuse to continue to refuse paying that or everything. But what a time to do it in the middle of a pandemic. And he basically accuses the WHO of getting everything wrong, especially over his decision to impose a limited travel ban on China, which was actually the day after the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. His travel ban, he said the WHO was against. Well, the WHO is not totally against travel bans. What they say is they usually don't work.
Right.
And actually, they might be right here because, you know, if Donald Trump moved quickly, but there were lots of loopholes in his travel ban, and now they have the most cases by far in the world.
Okay, thanks for the update there, Nathan. Let's get to other members of the panel right now, and let's turn to that very grim report that came from the International Monetary Fund, its World Economic Outlook. Anthony Chan, as we just heard, the IMF is warning that the recession would be the steepest in almost a century, and the global GDP will shrink by 3% this year. Put this in perspective for us. How serious is this?
Well, I think it's fairly serious. For example, the U.S. Economic growth rate of almost down 6%, which is what the IMF is forecasting, is almost twice as bad as it was during the global financial crisis. We know that even when you go back to the Depression, It took a long time, almost a couple of years, to get to an unemployment rate of 15%. And of course, we'll probably do that in 2 months. And it took 4 years for them to actually do something to try to save this economy. And it took less than 4 weeks for the U.S. to pass the CARES Act. So bottom line, we're going to have a sharp contraction. But once we resolve this health pandemic, we can see the economy recovering. So deep contraction, but certainly the upside will be a lot shorter than it was during the Great Depression, where that sort of was prolonged for a period of close to 10 years.
Einar Tangen, most countries will take a hit according to this IMF review, but China and India, according to the report, will see modest growth of 1.2% and 1.9% respectively. What does that mean for China? Because China might see this modest growth, but how will this be offset by very sluggish foreign demand?
Well, right now, remember, these are best case scenarios, 6% for the U.S. And 3% for the world. But if this continues outside of China, China seems to have it under control. It could be much worse. It could last much longer. There could be, as they said, permanent scarring. For inside China, I think China will have to go in, look domestically for demand and production. China is lucky in the sense that it has both the production capability and huge markets that it can sell into. So expect them to rejig their economy and to make sure that they can keep on growing. I think the 1.2 is a little bit modest. I think the 1.9 for India is perhaps a little bit, hopeful.
Nathan, let's look at the economic situation here in the United States. A bit of a tug of war going on right now between one of the president's committees, which looks at the health concerns of the coronavirus outbreak, and another committee, which he says is finalizing its brief, which is to look at how the economy in the United States will be reopened. Now that the president has said that there will be a committee on the economy, where does it go to from here?
Well, this sort of choice that the president has sort of been painting out as a choice between public health and the health of the U.S. economy is potentially a false one. I mean, if you listen to a lot of the governors, they say, look, both of them go hand in hand. And Dr. Anthony Fauci has been saying this as well, that, once the apex has been reached and we see a decline, especially in hospitalizations and new cases, we can start opening up on a gradual basis, but testing is needed. And we also need to do antibody testing to work out who's not going to get it as well. The problem is the testing has been slow here, very patchy. There's no national rollout of testing. The US president seems to think it's fine. So is he going to move to open up the economy, or try to, with obviously opposition from governors, before people know whether they have the virus, had the virus, immune to the virus, etc. Because can you imagine going back to work fully and not knowing whether you've had it or your co-workers have had it, even though we may practice social distancing? It's very alarming for people. And of course, as Anthony Fauci said just a few days ago, we will see a big spike in cases if that doesn't happen.
Anthony Chan, we just heard the IMF chief economist say that there will be there'll be a lot of uncertainty on the impact the recession will have on people's lives and on their livelihoods. What kind of practical effect is this going to have on ordinary people? I mean, are we going to see very high unemployment figures for the foreseeable future? And will we even see the kinds of economies that we go back to changed?
Well, I think we've already seen 17 million people in the last 3 weeks filing for unemployment insurance. So I think we can easily see up to 25 million people unemployed before this is all over. Offsetting that, of course, is the fact that we've come out with all these stimulus packages. Here in New York City, where I live, if you take somebody that makes $17,000 a year, they'll get unemployment insurance of $468. The government's going to also augment that by another $600. So on an annualized basis, somebody who loses their job making $17,000 could be earning the equivalent to about $34,000 a year. So the government is trying to offset this. But remember that until you really correct that health situation, the economy is not going to recover. And then your second part of your question, of course, when people lose their jobs, they get depressed, suicide rates go up, depression rates go up. So these are things we should not ignore either.
Einar Tangen, the IMF baseline scenario says that the pandemic will fade in the second half of the year, and then we can gradually see these restrictions being lifted. Is that realistic? Do you see that happening?
I'm afraid I don't, not given the actions that's being taken, especially when you start looking at countries like the United States, India. The United States is, as we've discussed, there seems to be complete confusion and antagonism between the state and the central government. In India, the real question, places like that, Brazil, the problem is the health infrastructure, and it's going to be very, very difficult. I think at this point, 3% is very optimistic, given the amount of world demand, the amount of the economy, which is dependent on discretionary spending. We're not talking about people putting money, putting food in their stomach. This is really getting to be about the other part of the economy, which we've been growing for many, many years, and that is going to suffer. So I think people should be prepared for much worse. And unfortunately, that is going to affect consumer sentiment. So you're going to have this kind of pile-on effect, downward spiral. Hopefully, it's reversed by governments as they try to stimulate demand going into, hopefully, the second or part of this year or early next year, when they realize that you first control the virus, then you start trying to pump money into your economy to make sure things are back up to somewhat normal.
Nathan, at the news conference Tuesday that the president is holding, his daily news conference, he said that he will be meeting the governors of all 50 states to decide on how this economic reopening will roll out. And I'm wondering, are we going to see a patchwork response from each different governor here? We might see Republican governors go with the president and Democrat governors who may be a bit more circumspect in reopening their economies.
Well, I think, at the governor level, at the moment, when you're dealing with COVID-19, the differences between Republican and Democrat aren't that stark. I mean, you do have your differences, for example, South Dakota versus New York, completely different philosophy. But what's really interesting is that we saw that grouping on the West Coast, California, Washington, Oregon, and the grouping on the East Coast, New York plus 5 other states, including Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, right, all coming together to try and create plans to sort of ease restrictions together, because there's so much movement of capital, goods and people through these areas. So, it's not going to be one light switch. And even the president has indicated that that won't be the case. And there are parts of the United States, quite rightly, that haven't been hit that hard. It's not densely populated. However, there's been very little testing in these places too. And we're starting to see clusters in the Dakotas, for example, at the Smithfield meat plant, other areas, and they have to be watched very carefully.
Thanks so much, Nathan, and thanks to the other 2 members of our panel as well for being with us. We have to move on now. As global economies contemplate coming back online, the World Health Organization is warning of a deadly resurgence if nations lift restrictions too soon. Earlier, I spoke to Margaret Harris, who is the spokesperson for the WHO, and asked for her assessment of where we are today.
So really, throughout the world, we're still seeing an acceleration overall worldwide. So we haven't reached the peak as such, but certainly in, say, Europe, it's a mixed picture. So Italy and Spain are now seeing a deceleration. That's a reduction in cases each day. So they are in a position where they've managed to gain themselves some time. And that's a very important time for every country, working out if they are going to ease restrictions, how are they going to do it, and how are they going to do it in a way that does not spark another rise in cases? So we've actually given some guidance on that, and we're giving some more detailed guidance that will be coming out in the next 24 hours.
What is that guidance? What are the sort of benchmarks or signposts that countries should be looking for before they start reopening their economies?
So we've really asked countries to think about 6 things. The first thing is your transmission under control. So this is, are you seeing a significant reduction in new cases. And by significant, I mean not many every day. So already that's a real reduction in transmission. Do you know where your transmission is? So are you ready? Are you able to test everybody who is potentially infected? Are you able to isolate everybody who's potentially infected? Are you able to find everybody who has been exposed to those people who are infected? And are you able to isolate them? So in other words, are you able to keep the infected, those people who may be infected, away from the healthy population? That's the essence of stopping an outbreak like this. Thirdly, if your society begins to move again, are your workplaces safe? Can people really distance, or you cannot put people back into situations where they're going to be crowded? Are you going to make it possible for them to perform all the hand hygiene to protect themselves? Are you going to make sure that if people get ill again, can you test them? Have you put in place perhaps more teleworking so you can reduce the numbers of people? What are you doing about your schools? Again, have you made your schools a safe place? And what about your health system? Have you ensured that your healthcare workers are protected? Have you ensured you've got enough space to still look after the very ill? And are you giving your health workers some respite by increasing the numbers of health workers? The best thing you can do for your health workers is have some empty beds to give them a rest. And finally, and probably the most importantly, does your community know what's going on? Do they agree with what's going on? Are they committed to being part of this? The fantastic thing we've seen around the world is how willing communities all around the world, everywhere, have accepted these incredible restrictions because they know how serious this is. So by and large, the global community has really made a very big effort to stop this. So ensure your communities understand what is happening next and know what their role in that is and are very committed to doing it.
Margaret, the WHO Director General TEDROS GHEBREYESUS says that emerging evidence is beginning to tell us more about the COVID-19 virus. It's giving us a better understanding on how it behaves, how to treat it, and how to stop its spread. What is this emerging evidence?
So we've had fantastic collaboration with scientists around the world. I mean, the first bit of emerging evidence was the viral genome itself, which was published 10 days, I think on the 12th of February, just within a few weeks of knowledge that there was something serious going on in Wuhan. And the publication of that, the identification and publication of that viral genome already told us more than we've ever known in any kind of outbreak in human history. That allowed us to test. That allowed us to understand the extent of what was going on. That, as you know, by the end of January, WHO then told the world that it was a public health emergency of international concern. But the other thing that happened around that time was we brought all the scientists came together. The meeting was in Geneva, but it was actually a virtual meeting because many people couldn't actually travel. And all these people came together and they agreed that they would work openly and transparently to assess all the potential treatments, assess all the potential vaccines. We now have more than 70 vaccine candidates being assessed, and we've got trials, really well constructed trials that will give us information rapidly, looking at the different medicines, the different treatments around the world to see which ones really are working so that everybody can have them.
We have been told repeatedly by the WHO, by national governments as well, the importance of social distancing guidelines. But these guidelines, they could only work in certain countries, can't they? In mainly rich, developed countries where there is the space. I mean, if we look at developing countries, these are overcrowded spaces. People literally live cheek by jowl in many instances. So how big a risk is that?
So actually in every country, there are people who are forced to live in very difficult circumstances. But you're quite right. There are countries that are very resource poor, where larger numbers of people are forced to live like that. And we, of course, have very large refugee camps in many parts of the world, unfortunately, due to conflict and other problems. So indeed, it has been a major concern for us as the World Health Organization. We have done a great deal of work with countries that have got a high preponderance of people living under these circumstances to prepare them for the arrival of this outbreak, and to look at other ways you can do it. And again, one of the main elements when you've got people living in such difficult conditions is to try to find a way to help those who are ill and those who've been exposed to those who are ill to be separated, because you're quite right, it is very difficult to socially distance if you've got no choice.
Right, and given those conditions, what about healthcare in developing countries? Do they have the infrastructure to cope with something like this?
So again, this virus has been a huge challenge for all humanity, because if you get the severe form, the only way you're going to get through it and have a chance of survival is if often you need ventilation. And of course, that requires the highest level of medical care. That requires very experienced, very highly trained doctors, nurses, technicians, and large teams of those people round the clock. And in many countries that doesn't exist. When we look at the numbers around the world, there are countries where it may be just 1 to 2 ventilators for the entire population. So we're doing a lot of work to bring in equipment, bring in training, bring in protection. In fact, we've started something called the solidarity flights, because one of the problems with all the restrictions on travel, the disruption to transport, is that there simply aren't the flights, there simply isn't the logistical ability to get this stuff in. But we have now started doing this with the World Food Programme and other UN partners, and the flights are beginning. They began today.
What do you make of China's efforts and the measures it's taken to fight COVID-19?
So for the rest of the world, China has been the bellwether, has really given the rest of the world a lot of information about what this virus does in populations. Now, no country is an exact model for any other country, but the ability, the transparency, the information, the experience in China, there have been many articles indicating who gets ill, how they get ill, what people have done, how they've tried to prevent the disease, what they've done to treat it. This has given clinicians and public health experts around the world information about what they might consider doing in their country.
The WHO has come in for some criticism from the United States, particularly from President Trump. He says it's biased, it's China-centric. He's even threatened to cut the U.S. contribution to the WHO. Well, this was the response of the WHO Director General GHEBREYESUS. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
The United States is actually the largest contributor to WHO. And I have met President Trump a number of times before, starting from 2017. And recently, we had a call conversation 2 weeks ago. And what I know is that he's supportive, and I hope the funding to WHO will continue. And the relationship we have is very good, and we hope that this will continue.
So how confident are you that you have the support of the United States right now?
So we, as WHO, we're a collection of member states, but we're here to work across the world. So the United States has been a fantastic partner right from the beginning of the setup of WHO, before the League of Nations Health Organization that was set up before WHO. The United States has always been there, has been a fantastic partner, both in funding, a huge partner, #1 contributor, but also in terms of scientific expertise, energy, and just great goodwill. And that will continue, we're certain.
What can you tell us about Chinese aid to other countries? China has been supplying mainly medical supplies to other countries, things like masks, ventilators, respirators.
This is all such a part of what we all need to be doing. So countries around the world are now sharing what they've got, sharing equipment, sharing testing, but also sharing expertise, knowledge, and information. And this is how we're going to beat it. If we're all in it together, we all help each other, we're going to get through it, and we're going to get out of it.
There have been some discussions, and very controversial discussions, on where this virus originated. What are your thoughts on that?
So the information we have, and this is again from genetics, because we know the genome of this virus, it's very similar to a virus that lives very comfortably in the bat, in a particular bat that's common in the area around Wuhan. Now, we expect, since there's really not that much bat-human contact in the area, we expect that there was an intermediate animal host, and we're learning more and more that this virus is quite happy to go into a lot of different animals, but usually the animal host is an animal that doesn't get too sick from the virus, but then the virus starts to jump over into humans, what we call spillover, and it takes a while to learn how to live comfortably in humans. Some viruses never do. A lot of them aren't very good at transmitting from person to person, like the MERS virus, for instance. We saw the SARS virus in 2002, 2003, which got a bit better at human-to-human transmission, but this particular one really learned how to move from person to person, how to exploit the way we live close together in large urban settings.
There are some Western media outlets which have been questioning the data that's coming out of China. Is there any reason to believe that the information coming from China is doubtful?
So information around the world is variable, especially in a large outbreak. What you get quite often isn't necessarily complete, isn't always the exact number, and this happens from all countries at all times, especially in a large outbreak. But the important thing is, what does the information tell us? Does it tell us that there's a large outbreak? Does it tell us what was causing the rise in cases? Does it tell us what led to the deceleration in cases? Does it give us information about what works, what doesn't work? And certainly the data and the information we have received from China has given us all those important details.
That was Margaret Harris, spokesperson for the World Health Organization, talking to me earlier. And since we did that interview with Margaret Harris, the United States has announced that it will be suspending payments to the WHO. It is something that President Trump has been talking about for a few days right now, but today he announced at his daily news conference, the conference that he holds with his experts on the coronavirus outbreak, that the United States will be, for the time being, suspending aid, or rather payments to the World Health Organization, and that is pending a review of the organization's handling of the coronavirus outbreak about 3 months ago. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.